Good, whatever, to everyone out there. This is Nathan again from the Philippines. I'm saying whatever because I'm talking to someone on the other side of the world, of the map or the globe. This is again for the second time on One Life Only. It's Dr. Matthew. Did I pronounce it right? Is it Matthew or
It's
Matthew?
you want to hear how I say it?
Yeah, the French way.
French way, it's Mathieu.
Matthew. All right.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
Matthew Villatte. Did I
Yes,
pronounce your last name
yes,
correctly?
very well.
All right.
Very well. Thank you.
And this is going to be the second part of my series on two shrinks over drinks. So I'm still gushing over my creativity. All right, over drinks. What are you having? I'm having tea.
I'm having almost like you, water, but I had tea earlier, so I didn't want to drink too much tea. It's technically it's a good time for tea. I've heard, right? For me here, it's 5 p.m. So
Yes. All right. Pardon me for gushing over my creativity. So to make this different from my first interview, two shrinks over drinks, I'll call it two more shrinks over drinks. Okay. So very creative, huh?
yeah,
Very imaginative. Okay.
yes, yes.
All right. So I think for those of you who are familiar with this channel, I did have an interview with Matthew Villatte around last year. This
Yeah.
was supposed to be my anniversary interview with him because he's not just somebody I interview, he's also my consultant and also very, you know, even if we spent little time together, he's a good, I consider him a good friend. And, for somebody like me, with a small channel here in the Philippines and to have a doctor and author here, to spend, I think we're gonna have 2 hours here, right?
Yeah,
So
about that. Yeah,
Matthew,
yeah. That's what we did last time, and it went fast. So
yeah,
yeah, I thought you would have had enough.
yes, but I took you for your word. You said let's do it again, right?
Yes, that's right. I enjoyed it. That's true.
All right. Well, we're gonna pause after the first hour, and then we'll go for part two. All right.
Sounds
So
good.
this is for the audience, so they don't get bored with us.
Sounds good.
All right. So let's start with this is a casual conversation for those of
Yeah.
you who are new. This is about eavesdropping over two shrinks,
Yeah.
listening to their conversation as friends. All right. So this
Yeah.
is not some kind of formal interview, but maybe I'll start with a topic like what was your practice like before? I have some history with ACT and RFT.
Hmm.
Can you tell me and myself and the audience here, if how ACT has influenced
Yeah.
maybe a bit of your work, but mostly I'd like to know about your personal journey in
Yeah.
life.
Sure.
Hmm.
Yeah, it is. I could almost say that my practice has always been with ACT and RFT because I was studying it while I was doing my PhD. I did my PhD dissertation with RFT, and I discovered ACT pretty much at the same time. It's my trainer, my supervisor on my clinical internship was name is Jean-Louis Monestès. Wrote also a bunch of books in French, and but also some articles and chapters and things like that. A lot of research. He's a professor in France now, and he and I got very interested in ACT and RFT while I was doing my internship with him, and I was working on my dissertation. So I was actually being trained in doing clinical work while we were discovering ACT. What I mean by discovering is that we had heard of it, starting to read some books, articles, starting to, there's a colleague from Switzerland who sent us some videos of his some therapy sessions. So that was a time when there was not a lot of resources. So we would learn a lot by ourselves, listening to podcasts like that. It started to exist a little bit, in English from conferences of the ACT, RFT, CBS conferences. And so it is, in a way, I felt almost like, well, did I have a practice before? Because I started to get into ACT pretty early, but actually I did because I didn't really start doing ACT fully during my internship. We were starting to explore that, but I was really mostly trained in the more traditional CBT, cognitive behavioral
CBT.
therapy. And my background is really even more like behavioral than cognitive behavioral therapy. So I was coming from a very Skinnerian approach. My supervisor on my for my dissertation and my mentor during my whole education for my PhD was what we call a radical behaviorist. So a Skinnerian behaviorist. And so my practice was really mostly behavioral, but really in the sense of, you know, when what we call first wave or second wave to some extent of CBT, meaning really focused on changing behaviors through managing consequences of behaviors, you know, reinforcement, extinction. We don't usually punish behavior, but we can assess if behaviors are punished in the natural environment of our clients. For example, let's say a client who has depression has a hard time doing things that in their lives, like getting up in the morning, making friends, things like that. You might analyze what is getting in the way. So what is reinforcing certain behaviors, like staying in bed, or what is punishing behaviors, like talking to other people. If every time this person talks with other people, the others are saying, "Oh, don't bother us with your stuff," that can be a bit punishing, for example. So it was really mostly from that lens of what we call operant learning, is that behaviors are analyzed based on the consequences that they have. And if the consequence is what we say reinforcing, a desirable consequence, something that you want, then it will tend to happen more. And if it's not the case, it will tend to happen less. That's really a simplified way of talking about it, but that's at the core is this. So it's, if you add to that cognitive therapy, it adds the element of exploring what people think. So it's not just when I get up in the morning, I feel tired. It's also what I'm thinking. I'm thinking I'm never gonna be able to make it through the day. I'm such a failure and things like that.
Yeah.
So that I was really working mostly from that perspective of exploring the contingencies that manage that reinforce clients' behaviors and their thoughts. And the approach was to work on what they're thinking, see if they can think differently, if they're testing hypotheses. What techniques that we call things like guiding discovery or examining the evidence as a way of seeing if we can help people think differently, to respond differently to their environment. So it's really mostly that kind of traditional CBT before I tried to get to ACT.
How about your personal life? I personally had some anger issues. How about you?
Yeah. For me, it's interesting because, again, it's very blended. I was, and I'm still, I guess, a geek, really passionate about psychology. So when I would read a scientific article, I would. It was not just about the scientific information. It was always. It's probably true for most people with psychology, because it touches on everything we can do potentially. So it's always personal. Psychology can never be just professional for me.
But like Steve Hayes used to have anxiety attacks or panic attacks, right?
Yeah. A lot of people have this particular story when they started to get into, for example, into psychology because they had psychological struggles. I mean, everybody has probably, but for some people, it's really clearly identified. They had some issues, and then that's maybe they work with therapists, and that's how they learn that they wanted to be therapists themselves. I don't have that kind of story. I didn't get into psychology because I wanted to learn more about myself or explore something about myself per se, but I was always interested in reflecting on my own behavior through what I was learning. And the classes that I took that interest me most, that's why I got into behavioral psychology, is that they felt really relevant. You could start to understand your own behavior better. It's true of other models like psychoanalysis, for example, but for me, the behavioral model was more appealing. It was scientific, it was very pragmatic. It felt like it could pass the test of science, and at the same time, it was really profound. And so, for me, it's not really like a moment at that time. It's more like feels like it's a continuous journey of exploration of myself. So it is personal, but for me, acts didn't really make that. Oh wow, acts changed something for me and starting to make me do things differently. It did, but in a continuous way. I can give you some examples. It was maybe a little later, actually. When I moved to the US, I became an immigrant. I started to have the experience of being an immigrant, speaking a different language in a different culture and everything. And it was really, I would say, ACT has been an interesting way of exploring the relationship I have with my emotions and the expression of my emotions. And for a long time, I thought that's the way I was, which perhaps could be considered a little more reserved. I think people usually would think at first that maybe I was a little more distant, maybe not cold, but maybe not super warm at first. I think people tend to be a bit intimidated by me at first. And then if they got to know me, they could see that I have humor and like to connect and everything. But for a while, I thought, because in ACT, we emphasize so much the awareness of one emotion, and the workshops that I would do as a professional, there's a lot of self-disclosure, a lot of you explore your feelings, emotions, and then maybe you'll share with the partner. And so it's the kind of thing that I would not do as much in my personal life. But the thing is, it was also a very American context. It was not just the ACT context, it was also an American context, because ACT was developed by Americans. And even when you do a training in UK or in Netherlands, it's often done with that influence from the American culture. At least it was the case when I started in the early 2010. So for me, it was an interesting way of exploring perhaps my own avoidance, for example, with not with my own emotion, but more with the sharing of emotion. And so for a while, I think I really changed toward expressing more my emotions, sharing more about myself, self-disclosing more. For example, in the more traditional CBT approach, the idea of self-disclosing elements that are more personal with the client is not common. I would not say forbidden, but not common. And in psychoanalysis, which is dominant in France, definitely not something that you would do. Whereas in ACT and in other third wave approaches, that's something that's pretty encouraged. Not to share anything. Of course, it's you still have to be functional, and then that it's not about the therapy doesn't become about the therapist, of course, but it has to be useful. But that's the kind of things that changed my relationship to intimacy, how to approach intimacy, connection. And then over time, things I would say evolved a little bit again. Yeah, go ahead.
I was able to talk one time with a French dude, and he told me the French are like coconut. They're hard on the outside, but soft on the inside.
Yeah, that's probably true. That's probably true. Yeah. There's
Anyway.
definitely it is there's differences across the country. Like in a lot of the countries, often the south is a little warmer. In the north, I'm from the north part.
Okay, so you're a coconut.
All right. Yeah, maybe.
Okay, all right. So I'm gonna ask you something here. There's this what we call philosophy of science. In fact, there's a whole group of ACT therapists who are very interested in this idea of philosophy of science.
Yeah.
And through my graduate school and even my undergraduate studies, I never heard about philosophy being part of psychology. It's only in ACT that I realized that this is kind of, can I say, important to our practice, maybe. So ACT is based on an RFT, based on a philosophy of science that is called functional contextualism, or I think it's pragmatism. So it's kind of a heavy term, so we have a very broad audience here. So what is a philosophy of science? I mean, are there other, because I asked this to Lou Lasprogato, my previous guest in the first of this series. forgot to ask him about, well, how about psychodynamic or
Mm.
traditional CBT or humanistic or Gestalt, etc.? Do they have their own philosophies of
Mm.
science also? All right. So is there, and what do we mean by root metaphor?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
So
yeah.
can you explain this a little bit to me and our audience here?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think good way of think of philosophy of science or philosophy in general is that it's about how we think. You know, it's our
Mm-hmm.
world views. That's a good
Mm-hmm.
synonym to it's a what is the framework that we use to approach our experiences, to conceptualize those experiences.
Mm-hmm.
What I tell my students is that when I've taught a class where we start with talking about philosophy. It's a class really about practical skills in therapy, but I start with philosophy because to me it's something that we do anyways. You know, it's not like, well, philosophy, I'm not interested in it, so I don't want to learn about it. But the thing is, you are doing it. So
Mm-hmm.
if you like psychology, everybody is doing some psychology. Everybody is kind of trying to understand their behavior, the behavior of others. That's a human
Yeah.
activity. You may not care about reading about psychology, that's fine, but you cannot
Uh,
really escape that. So what is the benefit of exploring it is that then you have more awareness of how you think. For philosophy, it's really about, to me, yeah, it's you could say perhaps it's the most basic level of understanding, but it's very essential. So it's like a foundation. It's used sometimes actually as a metaphor, sort of house. All kinds of metaphors can work, where you have the sort of foundation of a system, and it
uh,
has to be very basic, grounded, solid. It's not something that's going to change
Matthew,
too much.
can I ask you? Can I ask you
Yeah,
this? Because you came from traditional CBT, right?
yeah.
So when you switch to, I mean, I don't know if it's a
Mm,
switch, but when you move more towards ACT or RFT, right?
yeah,
How did that affect your view of the person in front of you when you're in the therapy room, right?
yeah,
Is it more more mechanistic
yeah.
before and more contextualist now? I
Probably,
hate
yeah,
using those terms because the audience
yeah,
won't
yeah,
understand, the
yeah,
general audience at least. So,
yeah.
uh, is there a change in the way you view people and how you approach your therapy when you
Yeah,
switch
yeah,
to
yeah,
ACT?
yeah.
Mhm.
It's. I don't think there was necessarily a big switch. I think it's a slow process. Or sometimes you think you understand, and then you're still
Uh,
in the process of understanding. But for example,
uh,
this idea of pragmatism, that's really a central idea of functional contextualism that I
mm,
think is true of behavioral psychology in general. Like I said earlier, I was attracted to behavioral psychology because it's an approach
mhm,
that is pragmatic. It's functional. You can do
mm,
something with it. It's really at the core of this approach, and that was very appealing to me. At the same time, there is a risk when you start to apply this way of thinking in the becoming it can become very mechanistic. You can start to approach the humans perhaps a little too much as a machine, and you say, oh, I see how it works. I can replace this thought and put another thought, and then they're going to be
y-
fine. This idea,
yes, yes,
you start to approach humans more like a problem to solve as machines to fix. And it's not
yes, yes,
exactly the same thing. Being functional doesn't mean that you approach people as machines. It
yes,
means that you're understanding in how things work, how things impact
yeah.
each other, the dynamic. I don't think you can do psychotherapy if you don't have a philosophy that is functional. Because if you're in
Yeah.
psychotherapy, you're interested in helping people and using some knowledge to help people. So it is going to have to be functional in some way. But I think
Mm,
functional contextualism is really radically, we could say, functional in that it's we have that full understanding that the theory that we build needs to be useful. So
mm,
we're not approaching truth in a too essential way. It's
mm,
something that's dynamic, that can evolve, that can be transformed, as
yes.
long as it helps always our goals. And the goal in therapy is to help people get better, to say it simply. So yes, it did switch to some extent
Mhm,
in that I think ACT was more clear, perhaps,
mm,
more radical, perhaps, but I think more a matter of clarity with regards to that pragmatism than CBT, which I think is pragmatic too. It's also about helping people get better and with techniques. So it is pragmatic, but I think more mechanistic. Definitely something, ACT in a way, it's like, it's a form of CBT, but that's more humanistic, we could say. The approach
mm,
is clients, patients more as a whole people instead of
Mm-hmm.
machines that we can understand from the outside and fix by changing variables. It is more
Uh-huh.
integrated. So yeah, it did change something in my approach. I would say also it's in the end, it made more sense also to how I was perhaps intuitively approaching the world and myself and other people. But that's probably true of everybody. I think it's
Yeah.
yeah,
You
I
know,
think go ahead.
Nacho, when I started doing my work, I was kind of just, you know, uh, if the client comes to me with a problem like anger, then I use this. I get a manual, and
Yes.
I check it out. What is the process? And mostly it's
Yeah.
traditional CBT, right?
Yeah.
Trying to change your thoughts
Yeah.
about, uh, irrational thoughts into more rational
Hmm.
ones. All right.
Yeah.
And I realized that it's virtually impossible to, deal with every client with every. So it kind of limited my practice. So
Yeah. Hmm.
in a way, ACT helped me, come up with these processes that
Hmm.
are very simple, very little a small set of processes that I'm able to deal with. All right.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of this, we when you go through the clinical books about ACT, they talk about precision, depth, and scope.
Yes.
All right. So there's, I think, I don't know if I'm correct in saying this, that counseling is both science and an art
Hmm.
combined. So
Hmm.
there's, since we are all different,
Yeah.
it's very hard to. It's not a real. I don't know if you call it hard science, if that's correct way to say it.
Yeah,
Uh,
I don't know where the to draw the line between hard science, soft science. I'm not sure there's
uh,
really a line to draw, but
yeah.
it's harder to conduct experiments on humans.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
the results we have from science tend to be a little less certain, I
Yes.
suppose. That's maybe
So
what makes it less hard.
yeah, and this precision, depth and scope are the criteria we use to adapt a certain kind of approach to therapy. Okay,
Yeah,
so for
yeah.
our general audience, can you explain what this means? Why is it important to how psychotherapy is done, and how does this affect therapists in their choice of approach to adapt in their practice,
Yeah.
and also for clients? Does that will that help them choose the kind of therapist they or the kind of approach
Mm,
they want to you know uh, let's say use as criteria for choosing the kind of therapist
yeah,
they're going to.
yeah,
So can you explain what, because it's very technical, precision,
yeah, yeah,
depth, and scope.
yeah,
What do we
yeah.
mean by that?
Basically, the idea behind these three terms, precision, scope, and depth, is what? Is that we try to develop a science and so then a model of psychotherapy that can use
Hmm.
the simplest sets of and the fewer sets of principles necessary to
Uh-huh.
explain and deal with the widest variety of issues in scope and depth, meaning
Hmm.
we should be able to approach everything in depth from say thoughts about life in general to things that are much more specific. How am I going to get up to today? But even in the different domains, like your biological system, for example, there should be a consistency across these different levels of analysis. And
uh,
then same thing in terms of scope, meaning if my theory works to explain your behavior as you're giving this doing this podcast, that should
uh,
be able to also help me understand your behavior when you're in your personal life, when you're doing therapy. There are different contexts, of course, but if I have to
uh,
completely change my theory every time, it's not very
hmm
efficient in terms of theory.
uh,
So if you have to do it, you have to do it. I'm not saying it's an absolute law, but it means that we're trying always to move toward as much scope and depth as possible. And that's to be opposed to approaches where you would have a completely different model every time. It happens in psychology. There are theories that are applied to very specific situations. And the problem is what happens is often you realize that there's a whole new model and new sets of terms, technical terms and jargon for every new domain or every level of analysis,
Yes,
but in
yes.
fact, it's not really different. So it's very confusing. Imagine, let's take an analogy. I think it will help, a metaphor. Perhaps I'm, didn't think of it before, so I have to see if it works well. But imagine that your house, and for every door to open the door, the doorknob, it's I have to teach you a different way of doing it by using different terms. So I don't call it doorknob. I say instead of pushing, I say you have to press. Every time it's a different system, until the point you realize, but wait a second, in fact, it's the same. Every time I just push the knob and I open the door. Why do you call it a different way now? Why do you call the door a chair? And why do you call the doorknob, I don't know, a key or something? It makes it unnecessarily complicated. You could have just told me to open the door, you turn the doorknob. It's kind of the same idea here. Now, of course, the resistance to it might be to say, oh, but wait, it's not the same thing. You don't approach human behavior the same way in every domain. There are lots of differences, and the biological system is not the same as the psychological system. Yeah, there are variations. There's differences, like you said, across people. There's going to be variation all the time. Even inside one person, there's going to be variation all the time. But there is also consistency. So precision, scope, and depth. The idea is that you with precisely defined principles, you're going to be able to understand, predict, influence behaviors across a wide range of situation, context, and that's the goal of an approach like that, so that it becomes efficient. It remains relatively simple, but the potential can be extremely rich also. That's the idea.
Okay, all right. Wow, thank you.
And I just also to ask, would that matter to choose a therapist? I would say,
how would the client, when he or she or they see a therapist, how would they know that, hey, this is not, there's no precision, there's no scope, there's no depth? I mean, how do you notice that? As if
it's a
you
very
were
good question.
Yeah,
I think you would see it through a sense of continuity across the session in therapy, for example. Clients, they will come to therapy and they will talk about what happened during the week, and then they might be saying, oh, but right now there are things going on in my life. And what can happen with a therapist who doesn't have that coherent framework is that they might also get, in fact, that's often what the client is struggling with, is they have a difficulty integrating all the things that are happening in their lives, making sense in an integrated way. So they appear as kind of fragmented. That's something you can see with in anxiety, for example. Often, I have so much to do in my work, my relationship, or in my kids, and so they're all over the place. What might be helpful is to see how they're responding to their emotions in general. For example, what do they do when they start to have that anxiety? You see, it's simpler, but you can look at it from that perspective and you realize, oh yeah, at work, when you feel anxious, you start to avoid it. When you're with your kids and you feel anxious, you avoid it. You do it in a different way. Perhaps at work, you start to work a lot to deal with anxiety. With your kids, perhaps you avoid being around them, and you pretend to be busy. With your partner, something else. But at some level, it's the same. So I think for a client, the benefit is that I think you can address more issues with a simpler set of processes, instead of every time it seems like we are dealing with a completely new problem.
Yeah. I get it. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's I felt that I was a client before, and sometimes, how do I address this issue? I have several issues in my life, but it seems to be I have to use this kind of thinking towards this problem, another kind of thinking. So it's a different worldview every time there's a new problem that comes up, and that could really be confusing. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I think it's issues that clients have in their lives, they are a little contagious. So therapists can be taken in that dynamic too. It often happens when I work in supervision with therapists. I often realize that it gets contagious also through their supervision too. So for example, the client comes to therapy and they all fragmented all over the place. Things are not very connected. and then the therapist is having a hard time. They're also starting to try to address all these issues in a separate way. Then they
Yeah.
talk about it with me, and I'm starting to get into that dynamic too. So it's something that at some point you have to reverse and say, okay, wait a second, let's step back. Do we see a pattern here? So that's a
Mhm.
typical thing in acts. You see, oh, here's this person who drinks a lot. Here's this person who maybe procrastinates, and this person who also has a lot of relationship issues, and then you keep adding things, and then you at some point you're like, wait, let's stop back for a moment. What could be the common function? That's the term we use, the function. Like I say, it's a functional approach. So we are looking at the function, meaning what at some level maybe they share the same purpose. It could be, oh yeah, how to reduce anxiety, or
Yes.
how to feel more in control, or how to feel more seen, or how to find some sort of sense of
Matthew,
purpose. Yeah,
can you use another word instead of function? Because sometimes, for me, when I started acting,
yeah,
it sounded very technical. Could you
yeah,
use motivation or reason or I don't know, that kind of push towards doing something?
yeah.
Is
It's
that
you
what
can
we mean?
replace it with other terms, but you have to be careful not
Or
to replace it completely, because function is
purpose, maybe the purpose of this
yes, yes,
particular behavior.
all that is true, but
Mm-hmm.
functions can there can be different kinds of function. But
Mm,
basically, we could say it this way: it's how say what is the function of a behavior? It's how it
mm,
relates to the environment. How it's so it could be what is the purpose of this behavior, but it can also be what is the antecedent of that behavior, what has led this behavior to happen, what is the history. It is often I said in the past, function is like effect. What is the effect? What is the impact? It's a pretty good synonym, but it can be there's some nuances around that. To me, really,
yeah.
the idea is that how does it fit with the whole? How
Mm,
does it make sense? What is the so yeah? Purpose is not about the about
mm-hmm.
synonym. Like, why do you eat so much? Let's try to find the function of binge eating, for example. Someone who has
Yeah.
issue with eating disordered eating or eating disorders.
Uh,
What is the function? What purpose does it serve? But also, in what context does it happen? It's
yes.
like, oh,
All
it's
right.
when I am alone at home, starting
Uh,
to feel anxious, starting to feel
yeah.
some knots
Yeah.
in my stomach, and then
Yeah.
I'm been feeling a need for comfort. Then I start
Uh,
eating. So the function of eating, binge eating, is to reduce anxiety, to find comfort. You see,
mm-hmm.
that's so it's how it relates to other experiences that I'm having.
Yes. Yes. All right. Okay. Excellent. Now we're down to our last 8 minutes for the first hour.
Hmm, went fast.
Now,
We didn't start on
before
time.
before we go there, I'll probably pose this question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Now, I recently been reading up on he's very hard to read. BF Skinner.
Ah,
Honestly. I don't know how people understand him. But anyway, he wrote about
which book are you reading?
Beyond Freedom and Dignity,
Ah, yeah,
the
yeah, the
controversial
classic.
title.
Yeah, yeah,
He got a lot of flack for using that title, I
yeah.
guess, from what I know. He spoke about, or he wrote about, a pre-scientific way of explaining human
Mm,
behavior. Okay, so and he said that behavior is still attributed to human nature. There's an extensive psychology of individual differences in
mhm,
which people are compared and described in terms of traits of character,
mhm,
capacities, or abilities. All right. Almost everyone, politician, scientist, philosopher, people in literature, economists, psychologists, linguists, theologians, educators, even psychotherapists continue to talk about human behavior in a pre-scientific way.
yeah, yeah,
So some of the terms, we're talking about function and context, right?
yes,
Function, their purpose for doing things. We attribute behavior to attitudes. That's a
yeah,
pre-scientific term.
yeah,
Pride, sense of responsibility, concern, will to power, paranoid delusions,
mhm,
minds, death instinct, you know.
yeah,
So all of these, terms that he used in the book. This was
Yeah.
published in 1971.
Yeah.
Does this still hold true in some of the ways modern day psychology explains how people behave as they do? I mean, is there are there still approaches in psychology, or maybe do you still see this among uh, when you watch TV and you talk about people discussing a topic like climate change or something? People have to be more responsible about their waste and how they get rid of the waste. So do you still see this around?
Yeah, so you're talking about is really that distinction between internal and external attribution. It's something that's been studied in social psychology, so outside behavioral psychology.
Uh,
It's really how we explain behavior based on internal variables. So like you said, character, instinct, things like that,
yes, yes, yes,
state of mind, personality, things like that, or more on external variables. So it would be like, well, it's because of, for example, the my history of learning, the interactions I've had, experiences I've had, or for example, I could be like, if I'm irritable today, I could explain it through my character, my personality, or I could say, well, it's very hot today, and people tend to be more irritable when it's hot. So it's kind of that we could say that behavioral psychology is more on the external side, but it gets more complex than that, because we can also look at emotions and things like that as external variable at some point. But really, the criticism of Skinner here is to say we don't explain really anything if we stop at this level of internality, because then what do you do with that? What are you going to do with that? You say for example, oh, this person has
like
anger
the
issues.
MBC. What was it? IAT. I forgot about
Oh yeah, the
the
implicit assessment.
Myers-Briggs
Yeah,
something, the trait
yeah,
theory. You're this
yeah,
type of personality, or a type A,
yeah,
type
yeah, yeah,
B.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
the issue is that it seems like you're explaining something, because what happens is usually is that you observe a pattern of behavior, right?
Yeah.
It's a typical dynamic that, like I said, you don't have to be a psychologist to do that. Everybody does that. It's a process of categorization. You observe
Uh-huh.
someone behave repeatedly in a certain way, and then you
Mm.
start to put that together, conceptualize, and you say, okay, well, this person is tends to get angry, or is rigid. This person tends to be rigid. Okay.
Okay.
And then you start to explain why they behave the way they behave through these concepts. Why does he never listen to
Because
other
he's a
people? That doesn't
type
change mind?
A.
Because he's rigid. But that does not explain it. It's just the label that you put to identify a pattern of behavior. And it's
Uh-huh.
fine to put labels if it's a way of organizing. Say, okay, this person tends to act this way. Let's identify that. It's
Yeah.
classification. It's a way of organizing the way. It's like you draw a map, to orient yourself in the world. Say,
Uh-huh.
well, it seems like there's water here, so let's put
Uh-huh.
water on the map. That's fine. But if you say, why is there water on the map? Well, because there's water there. And why is there water here? Because there's water on the map. You don't really go anywhere.
Okay.
Right. So
Yeah.
what Skinner says is that you need explanations that are more functional in the end. He said, and to be
Uh,
functional, it has to turn to the context eventually, because that's
yeah.
what you're going to be able to change. So
Yeah.
why is this person often angry? You can
You know,
even use the label anger issues or personality, a rigid personality. But if you stop there, then you won't be able to do much with it.
Matthew, I really have this actual experience with
Yeah.
probably a small percentage, but still significant. People who ask about my work and they say, "Oh, can you diagnose me? I really need that
Yeah.
diagnosis.
Yeah. Yeah.
Am I MDD
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
BPD, or what am I? You gotta give
Mm.
me this diagnosis so I know
Yeah.
how to fix it."
Yeah.
Do you get that too, Match?
Yeah. I mean, it's super common. Even for myself, I found myself being
Uh,
wanting sometimes to have a label, a term, or being attracted to. You read about so a profile, psychological profile, an issue, or is that, and you're like, oh, I recognize myself there. That's totally me. And so what happens is that it brings a sense of coherence and understanding. And it's a big drive for humans understanding.
yeah.
When something is not doesn't make sense,
Mm.
if especially if it's important,
Mhm.
if it disrupts your environment, like imagine a big noise right now, big boom, I would be like, wait, can we pause a second, because I need to know what's going on here, right? Until I
Uh,
understand, and then okay, that's fine, it was just a car outside, and then we can go back to it.
uh,
It's we have to make sense always to so if you have struggles in it's very personal. Obviously, you have anxiety, or your emotions go high and low and things, so you want to understand. And when people want a label diagnosis, is, I think, we were saying earlier, what the term function, what does that mean? We could say, well, what is the function of wanting to know the diagnosis? I could say, well, the function is to bring some coherence, some understanding, and that
okay.
is very desirable. It is very useful in many ways. The issue is if we stop there, if it's like, oh, okay, so you have generalized anxiety, okay,
Uh-huh.
and then what difference does it make to label it like that? For a lot of
Yeah.
people, it's going to be somewhat, yeah, comforting, or it brings a sense of perhaps hope. Okay, now there's a name for it, maybe we can do something about it.
Maybe
Or,
there's a
oh, now
sense
it
of
makes
control,
sense.
a sense
Yeah,
of
yeah, to some
control.
extent, yeah. And connection too, because then you may also hear testimonies from other people who have the same issue. It makes you feel less alone in the world. That's a very common
Yes.
feeling when you have
Yeah.
diagnosis. Then it's like, oh, okay, well, at least there are other people, and I'm not. Paradoxically, you could say I'm not crazy now. I have this mental health disorder, but now that it makes sense, at least. So it can be useful. But to
And
link back to what you were saying about the quote from Skinner, the issue is if we don't have a model that also includes variables that we can directly access to some extent, we can change.
yeah, that's what he was criticized for. It seems like he's very manipulative.
And I think
Like,
it's fair to some extent. Also, I think it
yeah.
is. Because as I was saying earlier, you
Yeah.
were asking me about the philosophy and the mechanism, contextualism.
Yeah.
You take the more you're thinking in pragmatic terms, how you can change behavior, the more so you risk to approach human behavior as a machine, a problem to solve. You're looking for the variables that you could change so that you would change the client, and that actually it can lead to uh, manipulation, maybe, but I'm more concerned about dehumanizing clients by approaching them too much as objects.
Uh-huh.
By thinking,
Uh-huh.
okay, well, here's how it works, and here's how we can fix them. It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
manipulative. It can be very transparent, but you're still saying to your client, we're going to fix you because we know the variables that can be changed.
Well, you know, I think in many of the textbooks or the clinical books I read starts with, our work is about predicting and influencing behavior.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess in a way we do that in society. I mean, that's my point of view. We put people in jail. We incentivize certain in society in general. When let's say in our country, if there's a family code, and this is supposed to how a family is supposed to look,
Hmm,
and you
hmm.
get certain benefits if you're married or something like that, or and then uh we don't have, for example, there's no divorce here because it's being discouraged. So it's in a way manipulating people into doing stuff that
Hmm.
are consistent with what people think is normal.
Hmm, hmm.
Anyway, before I
Uh,
digress to
we
that
interact
topic.
we interact with each other. I mean,
Yeah.
every moment you influence your environment, just by breathing, it's an
Yes.
impact on your environment.
Yes.
It changes the chemistry of the gas around you. You're
Yes.
eating something. There's a constant transformation.
Yeah.
And then with people, with each other, yeah, you say hello to someone, and it's a form of influence. In a way, you're maintaining a good relationship, or
Yeah.
you maintain some connection. I
Yes.
think it's just part of just interacting with the world in general. But what
Yeah.
what we when you talk about manipulation, I think the the difference, I think, when we start thinking of manipulation when we use the term in a pejorative way, is that we mean
Yes.
without people fully participating in the
Yes.
process. See, right? So it's like,
Correct. Correct.
if I know something about human behavior, and I happen to know something about human behavior, and I'm using
Yeah.
that to change other people's behavior
Yeah.
without them knowing, and even worse, without
Yeah.
well, it's not to their benefit. And even if it was for their benefits, if it's
Yes.
without their participation, then it becomes me deciding what's best for them.
Mm. Mm.
So, and at the same time, it's a tricky question, because you're talking at the level of a country, for example, where I would not want to have to decide about everything, and even
Yes.
that
Yes.
concerns me directly, because I don't feel like I'm an expert in everything. I'm happy
Yeah.
that there are experts who say, you know what, we're going to drive on the roads
Yes.
with limitations, and it's going to
Uh,
be that number
oh,
of
well,
miles or
you have to
kilometers.
wear your seatbelt, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
Uh,
I certainly have opinions, and sometimes I'm like, oh, really? We have to drive so slow on these streets? It's kind of ridiculous. We don't have to. But at the same time, like, would I want to decide where it is? You have to also in society let go also of that power of decision. So, and they use techniques. So you said, okay, we're gonna get tickets if we drive too fast, maybe even go to jail if it's really a bad infraction.
yeah.
Or there's incentives for driving well and things like that. So in a way,
Yeah.
there's some manipulation. But I could also
Yes.
say at some level, there is also a trust in people who are in charge, and say,
Yes.
I trust you. Uh, do make the
Yes.
decisions. You're experts, study it,
Yes.
and
All right.
and so it's in that case, I would say it's the same. You go see your doctor. You don't know anything about. I don't know anything much about the biological system. So if I have some symptoms, I'm going to trust them, and
Okay.
I'm going to do so. It's
All right.
yeah.
Matthew, speaking of, we mentioned a few words like categories and this time influencing behavior and normal, right? So uh, we'll come to that in the next part of our
Yep.
interview. Well, I think we'll already finish the hour. So thank you very much for being so generous with your time. And I'll see everybody else here who's joined us in this watching this YouTube video or listening to this podcast to join us in the next segment, part 2 of this talk. And I'll have a lot more interesting questions for Matthew here. And we'll talk about movies too. All right.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
All right.